Welcome, everyone, to the December 5th, no 6th, I'm on the wrong page, 7th
Pearl Harbor Day.
Pearl Harbor Day, City Council work session. Welcome to everyone here and at home, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Hi, I'm Christy Hammett, Central Services Director. I'm staying in today for City Manager John Reese. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chief Joe Zaludik to lead the fireworks conversation.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Councilors. This work session is in response to Councilor Surratt's request this summer to consider a complete ban on fireworks with the exception of professional displays. As outlined in the AIS, the sale and discharge of legal fireworks are presently limited from June 23rd to July 6th and also allowed on December 31st and January 1st. The 4th of July holiday is always a busy season for fire crews. We can experience a 25% increase in call volume on the 4th. During the fireworks ban in 2015, we had only 10% of our usual volume of calls for fireworks-related fires. The number of fireworks-related fires went back up to pre-ban levels in 2016. Option 2 in the AIS is based on the potential for fire spread in the South Hills of Eugene. Using this methodology, it might also make sense to add Skinner's Butte and Gillespie Butte to this option. The present trend in the fire service is to support a reduction in fireworks use. This trend is supported by the National Fire Protection Association, who gathered support for banning consumer fireworks from 21 health and safety organizations that include the International Association of Fire Chiefs, American Academy of Ophthalmology, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, just to name a few. Today, we would like to answer questions you might have about a fireworks ban or partial ban and to determine what information or statistics you would like to see in the event that this issue goes to a public hearing.
Thank you. We're glad that you're here to present. Thank you for doing that. And I will just go around and take Betty, you're first to ask questions or make comments.
I want to make a comment. The last time we had the partial ban in South Eugene, which covers my ward, but I got thanked by many people. People were very happy. But I also heard complaints from people in other parts of the city who said, why didn't we have a ban? And I thought we should have a citywide ban at that time. I still think so, for various reasons. The fire danger is greater in some parts of the city than other parts, but it could happen anywhere. I think that one house that burned down wasn't in one of the areas that was considered most dangerous. And then there are the pets who actually go crazy. And there are veterans who think they're back in the war zone. And there are people, I've heard from people who say they have family members who have dementia and just don't understand and get terrified. So I think there are lots of reasons to ban personal fireworks, all kinds, not just illegal ones. Thank you.
George Brown, and then Mike.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, yes, it's true what Councilor Taylor said. We did hear from a lot of people who wanted the ban. I'm thinking a lot in North Eugene, people didn't understand. But I think the reason was we chose that area was because that had the most combustible dry material under the trees. The vegetation was much more massive. The fire danger was much, much higher than, say, somebody's yard, which maybe they water, maybe they don't. I think it makes sense to. I'm not sure. I don't know if I can go with a total ban. Maybe we might want to limit the days. And we might want to add Gillespie Butte, because there's a lot of vegetation there too. And maybe we don't want to do it if it's not a, really dry summer. If it's a normal summer, it was severe last time. We'd had a drought, and the combustible material was dangerous. It would have been dangerous for sparks to hit those areas. We could have had a serious fire in the South Hills, but I think maybe we should go year to year and monitor that. I'm reluctant to get rid of it entirely because, and part of it's personal. I grew up as a kid. That was one of my favorite things, was setting off fireworks in a safe area. with my family, you know, and I've enjoyed doing that with my son. So I'm thinking maybe we might want to restrict the days a little bit more, and then maybe add Gillespie Butte or any other area where there's, you know, lots of, it can be really dry vegetation in a dry year. And maybe only do that if we have another year like last year. Or we would make that decision, you know, later in the spring, probably, just to see what the weather's been like. So, I don't know, that's kind of how I feel about it right now. Thank you.
Mike, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you remind me again the days that we have already altered to make legal for personal legal fireworks? Which days are legal to do so?
Yes, the legal dates are June 23rd to July 6th, 2 weeks, and also December 31st and January 1st.
Okay. This is an interesting issue because the house that burned that became kind of a touchstone for this conversation was in my ward. And I have a number of friends and a handful of constituents who've written me asking for a complete ban. But I have to say that I am, despite those folks' input, I'm still in the same place I have been, which is to be open to the department's recommendation as we approach the holiday, to whether or not we should ban in particular areas that may present specific dangers. Other than that, as someone who loves irony a little too much sometimes, I suppose, I always am interested in this discussion of how we should over-restrict the celebration of freedom. It's a little funny for me, but I am not someone who would want to see a citywide ban of personal fireworks. I would, however, want us to work a good deal harder at being better at enforcement. And I know that's hard to do, but the complaints that are almost all of the complaints we hear, and almost all of the negative pieces that happen around fireworks use, happen around already illegal, already banned fireworks. And those bans don't work without adequate enforcement. Now, obviously, that's not the fire department's job. That's the police department's job, but we don't have the resources to give them to do that job anywhere near adequately. I think we should be focused on how to make enforcement better. I think we should be focused on how do we stop people who inevitably want to light things that blow up and leave the ground. I think we should be using technology to a greater extent. I've made this same statement, I think, for the last 2-3 years in a row, that there are plenty of instances in social media. It is pervasive in our culture for people to take pictures and upload them. That's something that many people do regularly with social media. And almost everybody carries a camera in their pocket these days. The interesting thing about a phone that takes pictures is that it also marks geospatially the X and Y axis of where that picture was taken. And I would think that there would be the capacity for us to engage the residents to take pictures that can be exactly marked and use those for evidence when they see someone who is illegally lighting prohibited fireworks. Thank you.
George?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I really don't know where I'm going to come out on this, but what I have to agree with Mike. It's if we pass an ordinance banning altogether or restricting to certain parts of town, it's going to be one of those ordinances that we can't enforce anyway. And Mike hit it right on the head. The majority of the complaints we get are the illegal fireworks that are illegal and have been for as long as I can remember. We can't even enforce that. You know, we set up a hotline to make calls in. I personally was on hold for a half an hour one year to get a complaint registered. I've had people say the same thing. I've had people say, well, I got through, but nobody ever showed up. So by doing a total ban, you know, you think you got a poor response the last time, and I'm not saying that to demean the people trying to enforce the laws. It's we just don't have enough people to do that. So if you think you had some problems getting a response before, if we do a total citywide ban, it's going to be absolutely ridiculous. The other thing, you know, it's already been mentioned about the partial ban we did in 2015, and I think it was done for all the right reasons, and I agreed with it. But like probably everybody else, I got inundated with calls. Well, why is just this, you know, that area there in the South Hills? What's wrong with my neighborhood? I think my neighborhood should be banned also because X, Y, and Z. Everybody that called or emailed me about the partial ban in the South Hills area had in their mind a valid reason why it should be banned there also. So I don't know which direction we're going to go, but whatever it is, in the long run, it's going to be unenforceable. We don't have the manpower to do it. So, you know, we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
So I've got Chris in the queue and Betty a second round, and I'm going to ask Alan if he has a comment to make. But my comment is that you need to think about whether you want them to proceed with anything or not, and we have to have a motion of some kind to indicate what this council wants. So you just need to be thinking about that as we have this conversation.
You mentioned that calls had gone up and down over the years depending on whether we had imposed a ban. Were those fire calls or were those complaint calls, or what kind of calls were those?
Those were fireworks-related fires calls, which is a subset. There were more fires than were reported, but we could only identify the ones that we had evidence that were directly fireworks-related.
Okay, do you remember about how many that was? How many calls you typically get in a year?
We usually get about 100 calls a day. Our calls for service go up to 125 to as high as 150 calls for service during the 4th of July or 4th of July weekend. So it's about 50.
Those are mostly fire-related calls?
Fire, smoke, or fire-related, yes.
Okay.
The additional 25 to 40, 50%, yes.
Okay, so that's a pretty fair volume of calls that are in some way related to fires and fireworks.
It is, yes.
And would you say, do you have a sense of how many of those fire-related calls are for what are considered legal fireworks like sparklers and things like that, and how many of those are really due to illegal fireworks?
Without having the data in front of me, my experience tells me a majority of them are the illegal. However, legal fireworks can cause incidents as well. But a majority are illegal, either aerial bursts that go onto a roof and then find their way into a gutter or cause a problem up in a tree.
Okay, okay. If we were to ban fireworks, what would be typical example of the fireworks that would be now covered by the full ban that are not already illegal? What kinds of fireworks are we talking about that would now become illegal?
There are a wide range of examples out there. Ashland is an example that they allow sparklers or snakes or poppers, but no other fireworks. There are also some thoughts and some movements across the country and even worldwide that talk about silent fireworks that are the same size, low to the ground, and are not going up into the trees, but they do not have a report or make a whistling sound that is difficult for pets and vets and people that are noise sensitive.
Right. In fact, that would be something that would be of interest to me. And like others, I mean, my kids played with sparklers, and I think sparklers are a pretty innocuous form of firework, and I would feel bad if suddenly, you know, kids could no longer even have sparklers or something like that. So if we're talking about banning fireworks, I would want any sort of even conversation around banning fireworks to deal with what is the real problem and not just throw everything out. A metaphor or a simile for me would be, I get lots of complaints about barking dogs. I mean, probably one of the biggest complaints I get is about barking dogs. And we've had a number of issues where dogs have attacked people. So dogs are a health hazard, they're a safety hazard, they're a nuisance hazard, but we're not talking about banning dogs. Because with proper enforcement, the bad dogs can be dealt with and all the other people can then enjoy having dogs. And that's kind of the way I would approach this. I want to have the ability to deal with the bad aspects of fireworks most of which are already illegal, whether it's through a combination of enforcement and through education. You know, there's some smart things you can do with fireworks that can still allow you to enjoy them without creating problems. So an educational effort, and then this whole conversation is pointless without a concerted effort around enforcement. We already, for many, many years, have had a significant number of fireworks that are not only banned, but illegal, and they're still being used in the area because we simply don't have the resources to enforce them. So rather than creating new laws that are unenforceable, I think we need to enforce the laws that we have and get rid of the nuisance and the problems, the noise, everything else are all falling under the category of illegal. And I agree, the noise is terrible. I used to have a dog and the dog would go crazy, but that was crazy from illegal fireworks. So just as I don't want to ban all dogs because of a few bad dogs, I don't want to ban all fireworks simply because we're not doing a good job of enforcing what we already have.
Alan, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yes, Mayor. I'm of two minds of this as well. I don't like the impacts that the loud and illegal fireworks have on our community, including vets and older folks that, and also our animals. I mean, my dog doesn't like fireworks either, but it's not the legal fireworks that are causing the problem. It's the illegal fireworks. So, you know, doing a ban on fireworks for those reasons, as opposed to fire hazard reasons, means you're punishing all the people that are doing ones that aren't creating the problem to get at the ones that are creating the problem, and then you raise the question of whether or not that would actually solve the problem. And I don't think it would. I agree with Mike. It's an enforcement issue. It's even if we had all fireworks banned, we would still have the same problem, I think, because the people who are shooting off the illegal fireworks aren't going to care that all fireworks are banned. These things are already banned. So one of the interesting things I read and maybe Chief, you can help explain this a little bit better. Other approaches that Oregon communities have. Ashland prohibits the use of fireworks at any time except wire cord sparklers, smoke bombs, party poppers, and ground snakes. I don't know what a ground snake is. Is that the little thing that kind of moves, grows when you light it on fire?
That's the little snake that stains the sidewalk.
Fun. I don't know what you're talking about. Those are fun.
Yeah, they don't make any noise, and they stay on the ground. So, you know, that's an interesting approach. But those are the wimpy fireworks. So I don't know exactly where I'm going to land on this either. Right? I would like to see us have better options for enforcement. I think using social media, that opens kind of a can of worms that for any infraction are we going to have social media be a way of enforcing our ordinances and laws. Because I think if you do it there, you have to do it in other areas to be consistent. But it might be a good place to start. But are there Chief, if we're going to do the next thing up in terms of ratcheting up enforcement, what would we do, and what would it cost?
Any of the enforcement questions, I'm going to direct, if in the event that we had a hearing, I would direct that to law enforcement, to Chief Kearns and his team will be well positioned to discuss the cost. I do know that on the AIS, to do some of the monitoring at present, we think it's around between $3,000 and $5,000 a day to put the staffing on to address some of the issues with illegal fireworks. But to do a very thorough job, as they do in Portland, it takes a larger scale investigation to stop some of the flow of illegal fireworks into the community, and that can become a larger cost if you're going to be very thorough in your interest of reducing illegal fireworks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the challenge that we have, and I don't know if there's a really good solution for this. That's all I had, Mayor.
Okay, I've got Betty, Mike, George Poling, and George Brown in the queue. I'd just like to make the comment, no criticism at all, but just an observation, because as we talk about this around the table. We talk about our inability to deal with it.
That's what.
And that sends a message all by itself out to the community that, oh, we can't do anything, so go ahead and do what you want to do because nobody can do anything. And I don't think that's a message we want to be sending out to the community. I think the message we want to send out to the community is through our fire department and law enforcement. We're going to crack down on this as much as we possibly can and try to uphold the law in our city. So I just caution us about how we talk about these things, because everything we talk about sends a message about what people can do and what they can't do. Okay, Betty, you're next.
Thank you. I can hardly wait. First, from a personal point of view, I used to enjoy what fireworks we could afford. Not very many, but that doesn't mean I think they're right. And the ones that don't make noise and don't go up in the air really aren't any fun. Those snakes aren't any fun at all. Why bother? I want to respond to a number of things that have said. If we can't enforce, if we're going to get rid of all the laws we can't enforce, I can think of a lot of laws we should get rid of. So I don't approve of making laws but when we had the ban 2 years ago in South Eugene, people were not doing fireworks, and people who around the neighborhood who in the past would have been preparing for a big party were not doing it because they couldn't do the fireworks. And I don't think that it would not be easy to find out which ones are legal and which ones are not if you see a big party going on and people gathering and drinking. And I don't object to the drinking. I don't want to outlaw that either. But the idea is to have flames. And I've heard out for a walk, heard someone say, "Oh, the grass is on fire," and they put it out. But it's quite aside from being bothered by them. I'm afraid to go to bed at night on those nights because my house might be burning. I'd like to be awake to see it to try to stop it. And my dog is not one that gets terrified. She doesn't like it, but she doesn't get terrified. But I know that some people's dogs really do get terrified, and it makes it impossible to. And that alone would be reason enough for banning. I've been taking notes as people said things. Legal fireworks can start fires. Sparklers can start fires. I know they're a lot of fun, but they can start fires. And children that have only had legal fireworks have hurt themselves, hurt their eyes, hurt various parts of their bodies, and started fires. Nice little kids can start fires. And I think, I know it's a tradition. When I was a child, I saved some of my firecrackers from 4th of July to Christmas, so I'd have more than my brother did. I'd say, look, I have more than you have because we always got firecrackers for Christmas. But I think it's dangerous. I think that people can go to see the professional performances, and that when something becomes dangerous, then you don't have a right to celebrate if you're hurting other people. A number of people said to me, please ban the fireworks, and I said, I'll vote for it, but it won't happen, and that's what I think is true. Fine.
So I've got 3 more people in the queue here, and then I'm going to ask if anybody has a motion they want to put out. All right, Mike, you're next.
I will have a motion, as a matter of fact. I'm doing it on the fly here, but first I want to say, just in the name of equal time, that is the father of a couple of teenagers when they were very small. They loved snakes, so I want to make sure we're fair to the manufacturers of snakes here. I thought they were a great deal of fun myself, I have to say. I particularly think that the mayor's 2 comments here were germane, and I agree entirely that we don't want to send the message that we're powerless to do the right thing here when obviously we should. So how do we frame that? And I think at the same time, you're right about what you're saying with this, that as an enforcement issue, that's a budgetary thing. We're talking about this in plenty of time to address this through our normal budgeting process, as long as we know what we're talking about with regard to potential cost. So, in the name of having an intelligent discussion to be proactive about illegal fireworks, I will move to direct the city manager to come back to council prior to the presentation of his budget with a plan to do an action plan and budget for adequate enforcement of the laws around illegal fireworks.
What's your motion?
Yes, ma'am.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded.
And I'll speak in my last minute and 24 here to say that the intent of this is we've already got laws banning the stuff that the professionals tell us is the most dangerous and that we know injures people. We've never done a particularly good job at enforcing that. If we're going to begin somewhere to do something different, I love Chris's metaphor, rather than ban all dogs, let's go find the bad ones and do something about it, know what it's going to cost us to do that, and make adequate plans and take action. So I hope you can support the motion.
I have George Pulley and George Brown in the queue, but they were not for your motion, so I'm going to ask them if they do want to speak to the motion.
I'll speak to the motion.
And George Pulley?
No, I'll pass.
Okay, George Brown?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, just briefly, I will support this motion, but I think that and to the mayor's point earlier, I think the message we need to send today is illegal fireworks will bring punishment in the form of a healthy fine. And so you may get away with it this summer because if we don't have the manpower to go hunt you down, but some people would be busted. And maybe with Councilor Clark's motion, and depending on what the budget committee could do, maybe they could come up. It doesn't seem like it's in the total picture of the city budget that big of an amount of money to have adequate enforcement. But I just like to spend a couple seconds here going a little bit further than this. I think one thing that would help was if we restrict the period where you can use legal fireworks. Currently it's June 23rd to July 6th. What if we just did it for the 4th of July? December 31st and New Year's Day, that's 3 days. I never said, well, I take that back, I'm lying, I did. Usually an extra day besides the 4th. Like maybe it snuck in the day earlier and the day after. But we could restrict the time when it's used, and also I think we could add Gillespie Butte. I think it's probably a good idea. But I also think that, you know, in the future we could probably amend the area here, because I'm familiar with this area. A lot of it's in my ward, and most of this is flat, and it's just like North Eugene, where it's ranch-style homes without big forested areas. I think we should try to refine this map a little bit and start the zone where the trees start, and the steep hills and the trees, difficult access for a fire vehicle, and an understory during a dry, and make it only happen during a dry year. I mean, extra dry year, and be restricted. But otherwise, allow legal fireworks to happen in the non-hilly, non-combustible, you know, parts of town. So, but that would be a future motion, I guess. So, but anyway, I will support Councilor Clark's motion. Thank you.
Betty?
I move to substitute a motion to ban all fireworks except professional displays.
Is there a second? There is no second. We have back to the original motion.
Okay, I want to say something about that too. It would be hard to investigate to find out whether they're legal or illegal if someone's having a big party, I think. It's not that easy to, by the time you get there, they can hide the ones that are illegal and easily. Thank you.
My only comment.
Mayor, can I get in the queue?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Alex.
I'll support the motion, but I guess I have a question for Councilor Clark about what did he mean by the word adequate. To me, that means that the result would be a substantial decrease in the amount of illegal firework use in the city. And is that what you meant?
It is, and if that's a friendly, it's accepted, either way.
Yeah, I'll put that in as a friendly. I mean, adequate, comma, meaning that it would result in a substantial decrease in the use of illegal fireworks.
All right.
Sounds good.
Okay. My only other comment in this is I think it's important for you to hear from both the chiefs about what they think our capacity really is, and they may have some incremental solutions or something that isn't where we're trying to guess the answer without asking the people who know. So I just suggest that, and I'm sure that it would be part of the budget discussion, but I think it's important to hear from the experts about what they think can make the difference and what gives us the best bang for our potential bucks. Yeah.
Bang is what.
Bang is a no pun intended.
Yeah, right.
Puns and irony abound.
Surely.
I like it.
In light of Mike's motion and then the city manager's recommendation of seeking direction on which option to take to a public hearing, would that option or would that motion include option 3 of make no changes to the city's current fireworks restrictions? Or would that be implied, or will we have to make a second motion to?
If my intent with this is to allow the manager the full range of speaking, as the mayor suggests rightly, I think, to speak to both the fire department and the police department, but with a heavier emphasis on enforcement. There may be things that the fire department might recommend that might make enforcement easier, and thus whatever the manager considers an action plan and budget that would substantially reduce the use of illegal fireworks. That's what I meant.
But I would just say from a motion point of view, you are not making either one of those motions.
Correct.
You're making a different
Correct.
motion.
Yes.
That's correct, and unless the council directs option 1 or option 2, then implicitly you are agreeing to option 3. You don't need a motion to do that.
I just wanted clarification on that. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready to vote on this. All those in favor of Mike's motion, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4. And Alan?
Yes.
5 in favor and 1 in opposition. It passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was helpful.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, item number 2 for us today is about rental code.
That transition here. So today we're joined by our planning and development staff, and I'm going to turn it over to Rochelle Nicholas to lead us through the conversation about rental housing code.
So, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Rochelle Nicholas.
You need to talk into the
Sorry. So, my name is Rochelle Nicholas. I'm the manager for the rental housing program, and I'm here with Lori Kaveth, who's the finance director with planning and development. So we're here to further discuss the rental housing code and the recommendation of the Housing Policy Board. So we have a short presentation for you. The purpose of the rental housing code is to provide minimum habitability standards for rental housing units in an effort to protect the health and safety of occupants. The rental housing code went into effect in 2005. At that time, it included 4 minimum habitability standards. In 2008, the code was expanded to include smoke detectors and security, which requires doors and windows be equipped with locks. In 2009, visible mold was added under the existing plumbing and weatherproofing standards. Today, we have 6 minimum habitability standards, with visible mold addressed as a symptom of water intrusion under plumbing and weatherproofing. At a prior work session held in 2016, Council supported a change to the rental housing administrative rules that would add a requirement that owners provide a local contact person for rental properties. The rule requires rental owners appoint or employ agents who are located within 75 miles to Eugene. A local contact person can more quickly respond in the event of an emergency and help facilitate other issues that may be difficult for owners that reside out of the area. Over the past year, staff has worked with ISD on changes to our existing database that identify accounts that do not meet these requirements. We will be sending letters to those owners early next year. There are approximately 35,000 rental units dispersed across the city. There's been about a 9% increase in the number of rental units in the past 2 years. This map shows the concentration of rental units by neighborhood. On the right side is a list of the number of registered units in each neighborhood. We provided a hard copy, colored copy for you at your space. As you can see, the highest concentration of rental units is in Bethel and West University. Since the start of the rental housing code, staff has handled 320 formal complaints. In addition to investigating complaints, staff serve as a resource to connect people to the available services in the community. Often tenants and owners are not aware of their rights, so staff may provide them information about landlord-tenant law or other available resources and services. The goal of the program is to help renters and owners communicate with each other to resolve issues without city involvement.
A refresher on what we talked about last time that we were here regarding the rental housing fees. Our fee is $10 per unit. We were requested to have its own fund in fiscal year 10, so we have a rental housing fund, and that was requested by the Department Advisory Committee. The fund currently covers about 2 FTE, half a vehicle, and some program outreach costs. It's about $300,000 a year budget. So if you look at comparable cities, our fee is equivalent or lower than other comparable size cities. Corvallis is $13 per unit and increases to $14 July 1st. Gresham ranges from $20 to $55. Medford is $40 or more. Salem ranges from $5 to $14 per unit. And a steady fee is easier for community members and stakeholders to understand than a fee that fluctuates up and down, and it's more accurate to financially forecast. So now I'm going to talk about the past expenditure history for the Rental Housing Fund as well as our forecasted future. Here's a trend line that's showing our average revenue increase. This is a trend line showing our expenditure fluctuations, both past and forecasted for the future. And here's a trend line showing the balance available. So early in the program, we were focusing on setting up the collection system and getting databases in place to monitor the addresses and payment system. We've built up a cash reserve due to the billable housing units increasing over time and our expenditures not matching that increase. We are increasing our outreach efforts, which will cause increased cases, more services being provided, and expenditures will naturally go up. The service level will start to match the resource allocation and the balance available will go down.
For the last 4 years, staff have worked with a committee of community members that were appointed by the Housing Policy Board. The committee reviewed program financials, program activity, a sampling of cases, and reviewed codes adopted in other similar communities. The committee provided a recommendation to the Housing Policy Board last March. The committee recommended a few habitability standards be added to the code. These included working electrical systems, carbon monoxide detectors, control of rat infestations, and working appliances when supplied. The committee also recommended that timelines be shortened when an essential utility is not working. An example would be no heat in the cold winter times. The recommendation is to shorten the 10-day requirement to 48 hours. The full recommendation is included in your packet. The Housing Policy Board met on Monday and further discussed the committee's recommendation as well as other areas of the program. The board provided a recommendation for City Council to consider. The recommendation includes moving ahead with the committee's proposed habitability additions and shortened timelines, remove the sunset clause with the caveat that staff collaborate with the Housing Policy Board to provide regular reports on program activity, step up our outreach efforts and education, and that the city manager review the amount of the fee. The motion passed unanimously. One of the primary concerns heard from the Housing Policy Board, the committee, community members, and City Council has been the need for more outreach. Staff has developed an outreach plan that we will continue to refine. Our focus over the next year will be to work with our community partners to reach underrepresented groups, including the elderly, people with disabilities, and those with language barriers. A part-time community coordinator has been hired to lead this effort. Oops. So additionally, staff will be looking at areas that have high concentration of rental units with a lower number of complaints. So for example, in this map, you can see that the higher concentration with the Bethel, in the Bethel area, has the lower number of complaints, even with the highest concentration of rental units. So a number of options have been provided in the agenda item summary. The city manager is in support of the work done by the committee members and the Housing Policy Board, and is recommending option 4, which would eliminate the sunset date, add additional standards, and move the proposed changes forward for a public hearing. So that concludes my presentation and available for questions.
Thank you very much. Very thorough. I've got Mike and then Betty in the queue.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. Appreciate it. I've always been kind of two minds about the policy choices around the area, although I want to say, I think, unless I'm mistaken, I'm the only one at the table on this side that actually is a renter. So I understand the world that folks who live in rental housing contend with. I am one for the last couple of years. And I will tell you that I understand the value of being almost an advocate, being someone who enforces the standards of living well in our community. That's a good thing to do. I'm in agreement with that. I think that those who rent often feel very powerless to affect real change in substandard conditions because they're afraid to. So I think it's a good thing to have this in place. My concerns are around how we've set you up from a policy perspective. So let me ask a couple of questions. I notice on page 3 of my sheet, it lists the complaints by ward. And I'm wondering can I steal your pen again, George? Thank you very much. If you could, I don't know what the total number of complaints is when you add up each by ward here. Do you happen to have the total for me here? I didn't do the math real quickly, but I wonder if it looks to be a couple, 585. That doesn't look like what I'm seeing here. On page 3, the complaints per ward look more like 200 or 300 there, but can you tell me over what period of time those complaints were received?
So yeah, complaints by ward for Ward 5, those are back to 2005.
So all of these complaints on this right here that look to be about 300 go back to 2005. So that's over 11 years.
So there's been a total of 320 complaints
Gotcha.
since 2005.
320 complaints over 11 years.
Right. And those are, just to be clear, those are formal complaints. Those are ones that have come in the door, filled out, we've investigated.
How many of those have we essentially, for lack of a better way to describe it, sustained or said, yep, that's a problem and this has to be corrected and addressed, or there'll be further action?
Mm-hmm. So the majority of them are, I don't have the exact number. There are some of them that we go out and there's other issues that aren't covered in the rental housing code, but maybe are covered under building standards such as electricity and things like that. And then there are just some that we go out and they're just not valid.
Can you estimate for me a rough guess, percentage-wise or otherwise, of the 320 over the last 11 years, how many are sustained? That was a good complaint, and they're right, by golly, that's substandard.
I would say 85% of them are.
85%. Okay. My concern is this. It's not, I think you guys are doing a wonderful job, and for what we've asked you through the manager to do, you're doing it fantastically. You're doing it very well. And as someone who rents, I feel like I have somebody on my side, and that's a cool thing. I am challenged from the perspective of what we charge owners, what the impact is for increasing the cost of already unaffordable housing, and what the cost per problem we're solving. If it's a significant enough problem in order to justify the cost that is being paid. And I don't know that I have the answer to that at the moment, but that's essentially my concern. And again, it's a policy one. It's not based on any way whatsoever that you guys are fulfilling what we've asked you to do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mayor, could I get in the queue, please?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. I'll add the extra time that Mike took to my time. Just talking. The reason that there aren't more complaints probably is that people know that the landlords know that there could be complaints. And that can make a big difference if they know they have the power. And in the other side, there are people who've come to our council meetings who didn't even know that they had the ability to complain. And I'm glad you're talking about outreach, because some people aren't aware of it. And people who feel so powerless, and this wouldn't apply to people like Mike, but people who are renters who are barely getting by. I assume it wouldn't apply to Mike, but they are afraid to complain because they may be evicted and not be able to go any other place. So it's a hard thing to do, to complain about someone who has power over you, who has power to put you out on the street. And I think that having this code is a lot better than not having it. I definitely want to eliminate the sunset. The people who are supporting it shouldn't have to keep watching year after year and trying to get it redone when there's a sunset. And some people may not know the history of our having this. First, there used to be a code 20 or 30 years ago, and it was abolished because people, during some budget cuts, thinking that people could go to the state, which is, again, is not easy if you're not well off and you have to hire an attorney. But it was students who caused us to do this. And they worked really hard. They worked on counselors individually and in groups. They came to public forums. They did research about what was going on in other places. And of course, those same students mostly are not here anymore. They've gone on to other parts of their lives, other cities. And there is no paid group who can keep watching to see that we keep this code. And I think it's up to us to keep it. As for the $10 a year per unit, I know some people who rent or landlords, and they think it's a ridiculously small amount to complain about. That's $10 a year for a rental unit. That is not a lot. And the 10 days notice, so they still have to give 10 days notice to the landlord?
Correct.
I think that's too much to require. Actually, I think they should just be able to call and say, something's wrong here, if it's wrong. And also, I would like to add my 13 seconds to 11 seconds. I think we should add screens. I think screens are essential. And I know that the committee decided that wasn't an essential part, but I would like to add screens to it. And definitely get rid of the sunset. Thank you.
I would just make the comment that one of the leaders who brought us the rental code is now an executive at Lane Community College.
Really?
Yes. Chris, you're next.
Thank you. I'm your council representative on the Housing Policy Board, so I wanted to speak directly to the recommendations that they made. And page 6 of the presentation talks specifically about those. The subcommittee that met to review the recommended code changes did consider some that they thought should be included, and they also said, and there were some that they decided not at this time. Not that they're not important, but it was a negotiation as to what was probably the best ones to include at this time. And where they were supportive of those 5, and the Housing Policy Board, after reviewing the work of that committee, also agreed unanimously that these 5 should be included. And so I think that's absolutely a great idea. The lower slide, which talks about the additional Housing Policy Board recommendations, the removal of the sunset clause was something the committee had talked about, and the committee had come out initially saying they did support continuing a sunset date, and from the conversations we had, apparently a lot of that concern was that there would not be the opportunity to do a strong systematic review of the code, and that if you just remove the sunset, it could go on and on forever with nobody taking a look at it. So the recommendation of the Housing Policy Board was to go ahead and remove the sunset clause because it's a good thing to have. I think even I can agree that it has done good work, and that if you want to maintain a sunset in order to have a strong review, you can have a strong review either way. So the recommendation was, and some of the members of the Housing Policy Board, which were on the committee and voted for the sunset, actually reversed their position and said, if you put in strong review, then I'm okay with removing the sunset date. The increase of program outreach efforts was also something we felt strongly about, and as you looked on the graphic up there, that is a way to take care of a lot of the surplus that's in there right now, and we definitely do need to do outreach efforts. But that even so, with that in mind, it is important that the city manager do a regular review of the unit fee to make sure that it's still fair and adequate. It's the city manager's prerogative, but that the Housing Policy Board felt it was important to make sure the city manager was aware that part of his responsibility is to make sure that that fee is being fairly set and administered. With regard to the notion of is it a good thing to have, is it worth the expense, I've been paying for car insurance for probably 50 years, and I've only made a very few claims. But I would never not have insurance. And while this is not exactly the same thing as insurance, it nevertheless is something that ensures that there is adequate oversight and enforcement of these, I think, very, very important elements of the code. And there is also an argument that, well, this also happens at the state level. Why do we need it at the local level? Enforcement at the state level is minimal. And I think having it at the local level has proven to be a much more effective solution.
I've got George Brown and Alan in the queue. George?
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, in reviewing this on the page 1 of our AIS, the number of calls that staff received from tenants last year, and then the number of formal complaints, 320 formal complaints since 2005, but 585 calls from tenants last year, which means most of those were not complaints, or maybe they were, it's kind of like when someone makes a complaint to the police auditor. Sometimes they fit in the parameters of the program and sometimes they don't. Obviously, I'm assuming most of the calls that you got did not. However, I'll bet a lot of those calls were I mean, maybe I should ask you, were they just questions to see if they had an issue and does this fit within the program, or? There must have been a lot of calls because people just didn't know how to deal with the situation that they had.
So we do get a variety of calls, but again, our goal is to not have formal complaints. Our goal is to help the owners and tenants communicate. And so we will get phone calls from tenants that sometimes would absolutely fit within the code requirements. But we will call the owner and say, hey, did you know that there's this concern? And maybe the 10 days isn't up yet, or so they can't actually file a formal complaint. But we'll just reach out to the owner and say, hey, we're getting this call. Did you know this is happening? Is it something you can get fixed before a formal complaint is filed? So that wouldn't show up as a formal complaint, but we're mediating ahead of time. So there's things like that. And then there's other things that don't fit within the code. For example, they've, been given an eviction notice, but they have no idea what that means or what to do about that. So we'll give them a copy of the landlord-tenant law or refer them to some other resource that might be helpful to them.
Yeah, great, thank you. I kind of suspected that. Well, so, as far as the $10 fee, if we look at this chart, we see that the expenditures and the revenue, according to the forecast, are going to converge next year. So I think the $10 fees, because a lot of that money is being used in informing tenants and mediating, like you say, before a formal complaint's filed, so the landlord has plenty of time to go, or hopefully has plenty of time to go correct the problem before it becomes a formal complaint. And that's all money well spent, I think. I think it's that we should keep that fee, do away with the sunset. Manager reviews the fee. But to me, it seems like such a trivial amount, and yet it seems to be accomplishing a lot of good work here. And so, anyway, thank you for clarifying that.
Alan, you're next.
Thanks, Mayor. Very good and thorough presentation. Thanks, Lori and Rochelle. I think this is a very important program, and we need it in our community. I agree that we should eliminate the sunset, but I also agree that we need a periodic review, and I think maybe every 3 years is probably appropriate. Maybe we could add that into the motion. I think the rate of $10 a year, which, by the way, would be 2.5 cents a day, is low and very modest and in line with other communities, according to the presentation today. I agree with the 5 Housing Policy Board additional standards, that they should be added and that we do a public hearing on it. One of the things that we heard in the testimony and forum comments is that there are a heck of a lot of people that don't know about this program, and we need to do much more outreach. And I understand from the AAS and what Lori and Rochelle were saying that we have a new community coordinator joining PDD, and I'd like to know what they're going to do and what else you're going to do to increase outreach. Because I think it's not so much that we have a problem of we're charging too much. I think that the program is not as extensive as it should be, especially with regard to outreach. So what are we doing to bolster that?
Well, hi, my name is Laura Hammond. I'm a communication and policy analyst with Planning and Development. And Councilor Zelenka, just to respond to your question, we very recently hired a part-time communications coordinator, and she's going to be working with us very closely on this program, looking for ways specifically to reach some of the populations we know we're not reaching at this point with the program, folks who may experience language barriers, folks with disabilities, seniors, and those in specific geographic areas where we know there's higher concentrations of rental unit properties. So we've got preliminary plans on how we're going to do that, and we'll be rolling it out very soon.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect of this thing. Getting people to know it is an important part of this program. I think that number of formal complaints may be what I call a false metric for success of the program. I think because of the ordinance, the fee, and the program, those things combined keep the number of formal complaints down. And without it, I think they would be much higher. And we don't need And there are people that don't need to call in and do a formal complaint because of all of the fee and the program and the ordinance. They resolve this with the landlord because of all this programmatic stuff in place in the ordinance. So, and so those things don't get measured. So I don't think that the formal number of complaints is the way to judge success in this. In fact, if we were really successful, we would get 0 formal complaints. And then if you use that as the metric, you'd say we were failing, and that's inappropriate. So I'm in favor of moving forward with the recommendation number 4, maybe with the added, with a review every 3 years.
So I think it's a great thing that we send out the message that we're trying to help our property owners be in compliance. I think that's a a good message for the community of people who have rental units, and I also think it's a good message to those who are renting, that they know that we're trying to get everybody to be in compliance in a voluntary way, and that is the goal of this, is to work cooperatively together and not to be seeking to ding people. We're trying to find ways to get people to come into compliance. I think that's a very helpful attitude from both the client and the owner. So, Chris, will you put the motion up, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And we could add the 3-year provision after the hearing, but I would move to direct the city manager to prepare an ordinance removing the rental housing code sunset date, revising the rental housing code provisions to incorporate recommendations from the Housing Policy Board, and to schedule a public hearing on the ordinance for January 17th, 2017, and to schedule action on January 23rd, 2017.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Mike and then George.
Thank you, Mayor. I respectfully disagree with my friend Alan about the metric, but that said, thinking more about this, I've often viewed this as a piece of government work that is unnecessary and duplicative with the state piece already in place. But I don't know if that's an honest way for me to look at this, because if somebody wanted to open and I've been thinking a lot about this lately, if somebody wanted to open a restaurant, for example, we would hold them to a particular standard about how they operated such a thing with regard to health code and with regard to cleanliness of the place and in order to keep people safe. And my personal political philosophy is that I like small government in all ways, but mostly at the larger scale. I've always said that I think that local government should be the most energetic in what it does, and that the farther away you get from people, that should be smaller. That's just my opinion. And so if I say that, then I need to empower the local government to do the things that are wise, that keep people safe. So in looking at this and looking over the recommendations, I suppose I can support that in order to be honest and consistent with my views on this. But I do have some concern with 2 pieces. Number one, I want the review to not just be Housing Policy Board, but to come before council.
Oh, that would, yeah.
Okay. And number 2, I'm not sure that I agree about the way one would evaluate the metric, as Alan has suggested. And I would say that with the increased both staff level and effort around outreach, I would, I suppose, expect to see an increased amount of some communication, if not complaints. So I guess I will challenge our professionals here, our staff folks, to find a way to express that metric in what you think is a more or most appropriate way to the value, and help us when we reevaluate to understand some of the things you said, because I found myself wishing I'd ask you that as a question, say, well, what other things are you doing that I don't see here that are important? So help us reevaluate with some of those metrics too when it comes time to do so. Thank you.
George?
Thank you. Yeah, I would have preferred option 2, which is to prepare an ordinance extending the sunset date, but obviously there's not enough votes around the table to get that one going anywhere. I will support the motion with the understanding that at the public hearing, people are allowed to voice their opinion about anything about the code, including whether it should still exist, what the fee should be, the recommendations from the Housing Policy Board, and anything else that they think pertains to the rental housing code. So I personally would like to hear from everybody on this issue, so I will support the motion to get this to a public hearing.
Chris?
Yeah, just quickly, yes. And I think people should obviously always be able to comment on any aspect of any legislation we're thinking about doing. With regard to the review, the Housing Policy Board would do the lifting and the study and the research, but it would always come to us for final review. That's I think, an absolutely important element to it. And then I think those are the main points I wanted to make. Yeah, those are the main points.
Betty?
I move to amend to include screens as a requirement.
Second.
Moved and seconded?
Okay, I think screens are a health matter.
Doors.
When mosquitoes are thick, mosquitoes are dangerous, flies are dangerous to your health, and if you do live in one of the places where there are chickens and goats next door, you're going to have more flies, and they go right in if there are no screens. So I think that's a part of health and comfort. I noticed that it was stated that here somewhere that they're cheap. They're not cheap and easy. I've had screens replaced, and I have one right now that needs to be replaced, and I'm waiting till I can afford it. Thank you.
All right, we're going to vote on Betty's amendment. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2. Alan?
No, I'd like the Housing Policy Board to look at it, though.
So all those in opposition? 1, 2, 3, 4. So it goes down, and we're back to the main motion. I'm going to vote on that. All those in favor of the main motion, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alan?
Yes.
6. In favor, it passes. Thank you all, and I thank you for the presentation, and I think that concludes the business of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.